So that's the next, it's sort of like twofold. That's the next point. The next misconception, which is sort of tied into the last misconception, is that queer studies is only for and about homosexual males, right? When you're talking about queer theory, feminists will say, and they're a branch of feminists, there's some disagreement, there's a branch of feminists that says, well, feminism, lesbian studies is separate from queer theory, and there is a misconception that queer theory is really only about homosexual male lifestyle, which is false, right? The community that classifies themselves under this sort of theoretical paradigm as queer include what's known as the LGBTI, right? Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex community. People arrange this acronym many, many different ways, but the basic idea is that the community of queer, right? So this would be sort of the acronym for queer. Pertains to lesbians, it pertains to gays, bisexuals, transgender, and intersex. Me, myself, I've done research and published on transsexuality and transsexual theory, and I'll talk about that nearing the end of this discourse. And what we have to recognize then is that it is fallacious. Another misconception is to assume that, well, queer theory only applies to homosexual men. That's false. It applies to members within this community, LGBTI, but I would also add that it also indirectly applies to and could apply to the heterosexual population, heterosex, right? So this would be the queer culture and the primary audience, if you will, primary audience, and this would be the secondary. So that when we're talking about queer theory, again, not just homosexual men, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex community as the primary audience, but also, I would argue, ethically, there needs to be appropriations and applications of queer theory to members of the heterosexual population. And I myself, in my own research, have attempted to take conceptions borrowed from race theory, specifically the notion of passing, and incorporated that into queer theory, specifically transgender theory, and I'll talk about that later in this section. So much of the foundational texts were feminist LGBTI hybrid studies, right? A lot of the foundational texts, I sort of disagree with Warner that there aren't any canonical texts, and I don't want to take his quote out of context, but much of the foundational texts were feminists doing this hybrid study, right? Feminists meet gay studies, right? It was this a hybrid study. Obviously, Butler, Sedgwick, and others really structured this theoretical paradigm on their discourse on this antithetical homosexual versus heterosexual populations, both socially constructed and biologically constructed, and I'll talk about that in a second. So if you look at the footnote 25, there's tons of text and references there. You should go through and look at those references if you want to extend your analysis. Okay, so the main things to recognize as misconceptions in a discourse on queer theory is that it's not, properly speaking, a theory, right? Queer theory is an amalgamation, a diversity of interpretations from members within the community, both academic and non-academic. And what happens within the community is that individuals are seeking to make sense of their identity and their relationships to members within their community as queer and outside of their community, right? Because within heterosexual normativity, right, we have heterosexuality as the norm, and we have inside of our population, inside of our demographic, an attempt to, right, this is not to say that homosexuality is an aspect of heterosexuality. I'm not going to complicate it, but within, imagine this is a geographic boundary of whatever state. We have heterosexuality as a norm, and what ends up happening is the norm attempts to purge, if you will, purge homosexuality and queer lifestyles from the population. Now, this doesn't mean that it has to be genocidal. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be genocidal. But what there is an attempt, right, through normative justifications to deny, right, to refuse to recognize, to alienate, or to demonize the homosexual population, right, so that it becomes this antithetical us versus you, right, so that it's homosexual on the outside and heterosexual as the norm, right. So the attempt is to have it like this polemic where homosexual activity has been demonized in a minority status, heterosexuality has been normativized in a hegemonized status, and it's sort of the us versus them. What theorists are attempting to do, right, what theorists are attempting to do is to say that this is itself a misconception, this polemic between us versus them, this polemic between the hegemonized power and the subversive power is problematic because in a sense there is this relationship, right? There is a relationship between the two groups, and explicating and justifying this relationship in many, many, many different ways is an attempt to identify not necessarily the equality, because we are attempting to preserve difference, but at least a recognition of the humanity of the group, right? Because insofar as I attempt to purge the population, right? Insofar as I attempt to purge the population, theoretically, I dehumanize the population. And all we're attempting to do is preserve difference while preserving humanity, right? So that's what's at stake. All right. The next section is the attempt to talk about the discourse on identity, and there's a lot on discourse on identity. In preparing the lecture for queer theory, there's many different ways that I could have gone about preparing the lecture. For me, since this is a very introductory account, this is an account to basically, in all my videos, to be honest with you, just to get your palate wet, right? Granted, I go into quite a bit of detail, but there's even more detail that can be had. With respect to queer theory, this is just the tip of the iceberg, the tip of the tip of the iceberg. The most important thing, I think, at this level is that students and researchers recognize, especially graduate students, they recognize that in a discourse on queer theory, we need to understand what the misconceptions are so that we don't make those mistakes. But we also have to understand, especially if we're heterosexual and we're not members of the culture, but we have an affinity for marginalized populations. I'm a member of a marginalized population being a black man from the third world, from the colonial, post-colonial third world. I definitely have an affinity for marginalized populations, so insofar as I do, I find some solidarity in the group as well. What we have to recognize is, how is it that members of the community, within the community, not by me speaking on their behalf, we saw the problems that Spivak addressed with subalternity, right? I can't speak for members of that culture if I'm not from that culture, and I'm not from that culture. So what I have to do is I need to engage members of that culture, the queer culture, and ask them, tell me how you identify yourselves. What are some of the problems that you have in recognition? And the theorists that are best at this are members of the culture, which is not to say that I, as a heterosexual male, can't make my contributions to queer theory, but the only way that I'll be able to do it is to try to stay genuine to the original voice. And for me, that voice is preserved in identity. So I'm going to go through, hopefully a little slowly, and talk about this notion of identity within the discourse on queer theory. The first thing to recognize is that it's called lesbi-gay or lesbi-gay, depending how you pronounce it, but contemporarily, lesbi-gay identity, quote, appears to be the spécialité du jour, right? Being lesbian, gay, bisexual appears to be like the spécialité du jour. It's what's hip, what's new, right? For sale on commerce carts, right? Now this is a quote from 26. This is a quote from 2002. It's 2011, and this quote still holds true. I picked that quote from Scover because, for me, the idea that there is an attempt to recognize the identity and quote-unquote validate the identity of the queer culture.